hi, how are you? Welcome on in.
Podcast by George.
Another podcast by George.
Podcast by George. Border to border, coast to coast. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on into another podcast by George. I hope you're liking that intro. I surely like it. You'll see Dr. Politics on that for people that are watching. Steffen W. Schmidt, he's one of the longest running guests that I've had on this show. So he's in that intro, folks. He's a big part of it. And I am delighted to have him back on the live line today. We're going to talk some politics. We're going to talk some current affairs and issues. And every once in a while, we talk about some things that people don't expect us to. But folks, Steffen W. Schmidt earned a PhD in public law and government from Columbia University. Now, that was a few years ago. That's in New York, which I always find ironic. He graduated from Columbia University. He's from Columbia. He is a founding and sustaining member of LULAC Council 307 in Iowa, one of the oldest Hispanic community and leadership organizations. He's also served as the chair of the Iowa Governor Spanish Speaking Commission. He was born and grew up in Columbia. He's well-traveled, folks. He speaks a couple, 3 languages. He's a cool dude. He's the author of 10 books, co-author of American Government and Politics Today. Now, you'll see that book off my left side here when we go full screen. And I think it's in its 20th edition. Now, this book has taught politics to more students in more college classrooms, I think, than any book in history. And he's the author of many articles and columns on Latin America, U.S. issues, cyber threats, the politics of disruption, and women in politics. He's a frequent political commentator in America and around the world, where they just simply refer to him as Dr. Politics. And that's kind of neat in its own right. So let's bring him on in here and say good morning, hello, hi, how are you, to the good doctor making another house call here on Podcast by George. Hi, Doc.
Good morning. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, I've got the book. I've actually got a graphic of it here. So this is the book. And we're going to start with it. And you are a frequent contributor to all newspapers and publications and magazines and all this kind of stuff, too. I want to start with this column that you just authored. And it appeared in the Des Moines Register. And I got to bring this up on screen to get started, because this is how the Register put it on Twitter. And I got a kick out of this because every word means something. Every photo certainly means something. I think photojournalism is one of the last bastions of a yellow journalism in America. And of course, they put Marjorie Taylor Greene on their Twitter feed with this article, this column by the doc, making her look like that. I mean, they could have chosen any photo, but why did they choose that one? Well, because she's a nut. I think that's why the Register did it, but it says opinion. The history of similar attempts around the world is pretty terrifying, writes Steffen W. Schmidt, because, Marjorie Taylor Greene was calling for a divorce. And, that's how I entitled this show, but I wanted to start with a graphic to have a look at it. Now, there's nothing wrong with her, folks. Just take a look at that photo. Okay, so here comes the opinion column. So, Doc, tell us about the genesis. Why did you decide? We've talked about this on the show before, but what prompted you to write this column?
Well, the whole idea of getting away from people that you don't like, which is basically her argument, is, she doesn't like liberals, she doesn't like socialists and Democrats. And she says, we got to separate out and have them go over there and we'll be over here. That's as old as American history. And even though it's outrageous and we shouldn't be talking about splitting up the country, it's nothing new. And she is not the first one to talk about that. And you and I were talking before we went on the air here that there are lots of examples in this country of groups and individuals saying, I can't stand being, for example, Eastern Oregon can't stand being with Western Oregon on the coast, which is very liberal. And so they've been talking about leaving and joining a neighboring state. The same in Washington state. Eastern Washington is rural, cowboy country, farm country, much more conservative than Seattle and the coastal area. Texas, right? Texas, we hear it all the time. When somebody in Texas gets upset at the rest of the country, they go, well, maybe we ought to declare independence again, then become the Lone Star State and become the Lone Star Republic.
Yeah.
So the point is that it's nothing new. And the reality is, and I mentioned this, I think, in the first paragraph of my column,
We'll bring that up.
millions of Americans really hate each other on the left and right. They can't stand each other. And, while they might not be advocating a divorce and splitting up and whatever, they really hate each other and can't get along anymore. And remember Thanksgiving, this last Thanksgiving, everybody said, don't talk about politics with your family because you're never going to talk to grandma again. So it's a reality, and she brings it up, and I think it's good for us to talk about it. Frankly, I'm glad she said that. I'm glad that the Boston Globe, Jacoby had a column the same day that my column came out in the Register. His column came out in the Boston Herald, and he said almost the identical thing that I did, and I didn't know he was writing it. He didn't know I was. Politico had another column that was also about her statement. And the point is, it is, a reality in the world that very often people can't get along. And sometimes they actually have an uprising and try to split the country apart. We had that with the Civil War. I mentioned a couple of cases in my column, Biafra in Africa, Nigeria. They wanted to separate, and it cost 100,000 soldiers' lives and millions of refugees and millions of dead. And it didn't work because the government, glued the country back together again. The same with India, which during partition, when they had their independence, I think 1947, the Muslims were persecuted in India. And many of them fled to Pakistan. And so you had this division. And in India, it worked. There are two Pakistans, and those are mostly Muslim countries. But there are still millions of Muslims living in India. And periodically, between Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and other religions, they go at each other's throats, and they murder each other. And there's, religious genocide. So this is a serious subject, and Marjorie Taylor Greene just makes it possible for us to talk about.
Yeah, let me bring that up on screen again and work through this a little bit. Again, this is the Doc's outstanding column in the Des Moines Register. Quote, "We need a national divorce. We need to separate by red states and blue states and shrink the federal government," tweeted U.S. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, a Georgia Republican. Now, again, this woman, she ain't all there, folks. I mean, I don't know what to tell you other than that. And she doesn't think through things, obviously. Georgia, where she's from, she's a University of Georgia graduate. I mean, she's all about Georgia. It's a blue state, basically. I don't know what the hell. If we break off into red and blue states, Georgia's probably going to be blue, and she's going to trap herself inside the big blue. But that's Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, her statement has been met with some praise, skepticism, criticism, and mockery. Sadly, it's a fact that Democrats and Republicans are moving dangerously apart, and millions really can't stand each other. Now, this is from the Doc. This is what he's saying. He says there's no question this would be the biggest thing to happen since the Civil War, when separation, a divorce, was tried and failed with disaster for America. And Doc, I got to just interject in here, and it has to do with the graphic that I used to promote this show. The majority of American marriages end in divorce. It's always hovered around 50%. I think it's slightly more than 50% of people that bother to get married anymore these days. They end up divorcing one another. And I've always said that, getting married is one of the most solemn oaths that you'll ever take. I mean, you stand up in front of your preacher, God, and everybody, your state, your country, and say, I'm going to be married forever, come hell or high water. And a lot of times it turns into hell and people get divorced, myself included. So, I mean, I'm not casting aspersions on other people. I mean, it's a fact that the average marriage in America lasts less than 7 years, average. So that's who we are. That's where we're coming from. So then you look at this and think, well, hell, the people in the country would never support a secession. They would, well, I don't know. We're the divorcees, folks. That's who we are. But separation of seemingly incompatible parts of the nation has happened many times throughout history in nations. And this is what Doc was talking about. Anthropologists say that from the earliest human groups, communities that were in conflict split up and migrated to find common ground. Empires and kingdoms fell apart. Sometimes it worked. Modern Europe is the result. So is Latin America. Come to think of it, yeah, the Doc says the United States divorced from England. Yeah, that's how we got here. So, Doc, talk about this. There are a lot of these kind of maps with people that don't have anything better to do than sit around and make up maps, I think. But this kind of shows you the factions in the country and how a split might not be state by state, but it might be kind of regional like this.
Yeah. No, and that's been discussed before. And it, in some respects, at least, it isn't the end of the world. If people can't stand each other and have real regional differences, it may be better to, be essentially autonomous and independent and be able to have your values, be what policy is and what the law is. Nowadays, liberals and conservatives, progressives, right wingers and others have to live together. And as you said, that's pretty tough to do. I mean, two people living together for many, many, many years is very tough because there are days when things are not going to work out and you're going to yell at each other. And, if you just kind of hold your nose and go, well, what the heck? Then you go on. And if you just don't like that, then you say, bye, I'm leaving. I'm going to do something else and find somebody else. And that usually doesn't work either. But I'm sorry. For some people it does. But the point is that the United States, that map that you showed, okay, yeah. The United States is an artificial country. It is not a country that God created and that is, one entity, just like Europe, has been an empire, and you had the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire tried to come in there. So countries are artificial creations, and they sometimes work, and they sometimes work for a long, long time. We've done pretty well. The U.S. is a very young country compared to other places, and very often they don't last forever. They split up, they divide, something new happens. So Marjorie Taylor Greene has done us a favor in raising a question that leads us to think about how things work, how we can try to keep the country together. And if we can't, then it may very well split off. And certainly people in some parts of the country, I know that in liberal parts of the country, people feel very badly that they're part of very conservative places like Alabama and Mississippi and so on. That's, a kind of interesting discussion.
Well, I wanted to bring this up on screen because this has to do, you talked about the liberal areas of the country. I encourage people not only to watch the show, but to weigh in. Send us some text comments and questions. And John Roberts is a frequent viewer. Here's what he says, Docs. He says, I live in Oregon, and the divide is definitely here, as you described. I perceive it as a big urban rural split in values. Yeah. Would that describe the problem in the United States? And what I would tag that with, or what I would add on to Marjorie Taylor Greene, again, not realizing she's trapping herself in a blue state. But the other part about it is a lot of these most dissatisfied southern rural states, they're not self-sufficient. They actually take more from the federal government on the blue side of the ledger than they send out or they provide. So they would immediately be compromised because of that. Now, that's one of the biggest arguments against this. You're biting off your nose to spite your face. Be careful what you wish for.
Well, that's true, but life is more about what your passion is and what you feel, and they probably know that. They know that the federal government creates massive numbers of jobs, especially in some of the states where, for example, there are a lot of military bases and a lot of veterans live there and are paid their pension, their veterans hospitals, PXs or Navy Xs, and obviously transfers of all sorts to rebuild after a hurricane, to build infrastructure, highways and airports, and all the rest of it. But if people feel really, really strongly about having things forced on them that they disagree with and don't like and actually hate, they're going to say, well, that's fine. I can live with that. We'll figure out a way to make it, but I just don't want, LGBTQ gay rights. I just don't want whatever it is. And that's a reality of human beings. Human beings very often go more with their passion than with some sort of rational behavior. And we generally don't accept that. We go, God, you're dumb. You know, you want to split off from here and you're getting all these benefits. No, I don't care about those benefits because they're forcing me to do things that I don't like. And that's why her idea, we need to shrink the federal government, is part of this whole discussion, because the federal government is supposed to make things equal all over the country. Education equal, healthcare, laws regulating liability and you know, all of that. And that is offensive to some people because, well, you know, it imposes stuff. And it's not just the right and conservatives and Republicans who feel that way. I mean, progressives and liberals would like to shrink the military. They'd like to shrink the FBI and the CIA and the Defense Department, which we just saw in a report a day ago, has been helping to create these facial recognition algorithms that are used by police departments and other agencies to identify Americans and make sure that there's no terrorism, but who knows what else they can be used for. And so, you know, that's something I think conservatives and liberals actually worry about, that particular thing. But it's not a conservative agenda issue. Liberals and progressives also don't like a lot of the stuff that the federal government imposes on them. You know, so we're constantly struggling with how to keep the place glued together. And it's tough. It's just as hard as a marriage.
Yeah, it is like a marriage in a lot of ways. Let me read through this now. I want to click through this quickly here to see, make sure that I'm covering everything here. We're going back to the beginning. Okay, and there's that map that we were talking about. Yeah. Most states are not distinct by liberal or conservative, red or blue, the doc writes. In fact, according to data from Pew Research, by party affiliation, her own state of Georgia is 41% Republican or leaning that way, 41% Democratic or leaning, and 18% in between. Now, repeat this, and I think both the senators from Georgia are blue. The governor is blue. Repeat this in many states, and you suddenly realize that political divorce by state is literally impossible. As Doc writes, most states are purple. And then here's the closer. It says, it seems like a better idea in the United States. We try to focus on the things which red, blue, and purple Americans agree. Otherwise, our adversaries will eat us for lunch. And of course, yeah, that's a nice way. But I got to tell you, Doc, again, you have to tolerate my lefty views once in a while. Also, I hear this all the time as to why we need to do things and militarize and maybe even secede and do all of these because these other countries are going to eat our lunch. My point is, I think Russia's got they're having a trouble eating their own lunch right now, and I don't think China has any interest in us. But again, that's the left side of the spectrum. I wanted to bring this up on screen because Politico has written a column like this before, and it has some interesting statistics in it. Mm-hmm. A surprising share of Americans want to break up the country. Here's why they're wrong. So, I mean, they're going to agree with the doc here. Yeah. But this is from a guy, this is in Politico, but it's a contribution from a guy with the National Review. So look at it that way. He says, divorce usually isn't a good idea. That's especially true of a nearly 250-year continental nation. There is no doubt the country is deeply riven along political, cultural, and religious lines, although it's not obvious that the poisonous contention of our era is worse than that of, say, the 1970s or the 1790s. And I highlighted the 1970s. Okay, Doc, you and I go back at least that far, farther than that, actually, the 1970s. I remember that era quite well. And I remember the people that were draft eligible that didn't want to go fight the wars, that were, occupying buildings and sit-ins and some violent demonstrations and all that type of thing. But I don't recall this broader toxicity with everyone in the country on one side or another hating each other's guts generally. Now, the war was a big issue. There was a lot of to and fro and toxicity regarding that, but I don't remember it being as pervasive in America as it is today. Would you agree with that or not?
I'm trying to analyze this quickly. Yeah. That we're focusing on the people who really don't like each other, and they're very loud and they yell and scream. But I wonder, if actually, and Politico doesn't do a very good job of proving that the massive majority of Americans would like to split the country up. We know that the very passionate groups on both sides do, and they're very loud. But I don't think most Americans want to split the country up. I mean, people living in small town Iowa, I don't think they want to split up Iowa. They want to vote for people that represent their values and their policy needs. But they don't want to split Iowa up. And I doubt if they want to split the country up. What we want is to be listened to. We want to be heard. We want to be respected. And that's true of everybody. Everybody would like to be listened to and have politicians and governments that from the municipal to the county to the state and certainly the federal government take them seriously. Even if they have views that seem outrageous, for them, those views are not outrageous. For them, those views are high priority and important, and they would like someone to listen to them and maybe implement some of those policies. So yeah. I don't agree that the majority of Americans would like the country split up. I think the majority of Americans are smart enough to know what that would do, what the cost of that would be. As I've said, I don't know how far we're going to go with this, but there are countries that have successfully or entities that have fallen apart. And, I mentioned Europe, which used to be, part of an empire, and then it began to split apart. My journalist colleague, Jacoby at the Boston Globe he told me, I was thinking in my column, but I didn't have enough room to include the divorce of Czechoslovakia. Czech Republic, Slovakia are now two countries. It used to be Czechoslovakia. I was there with an Iowa State program that was wonderful. It was a kind of country-to-country program paid for by the USAID. When that divorce happened, we were there. We were in Bratislava. We were in Prague. We were in some rural agricultural places in Slovakia, and Nitra in particular, where there's a big agricultural university. And the Czechs and the Slovaks have very different history and somewhat different language and culture, and they really wanted more or less to just emphasize their particular, values. And they split up with no violence, zero violence, and have been very happy and are good friends and get along as two separate countries. So it's possible to do that. I also mentioned somewhere in the article, I don't remember where, towards the end, I think, I have been to Quebec, Canada. Quebec City, some of those places where people speak Francais and have a great affinity for French culture, for their history. And at one time, it looked like they wanted to secede from Canada. And they just didn't like to have the English language, culture, and laws imposed on them. And it came close to it. But, instead of Slovakia and Czech Republic splitting apart, the Quebecois said, we've got to be able to get along. Give us the right to, to have our language and values. But with the rest of it, we should be part of a bigger entity, because that's prosperity for us and prosperity for you. So the French Canadians have managed, with big differences and not much love and like for each other with the English-speaking parts of Canada, to stay in Canada. But they've got autonomy. They've got things that, that they value. And I think that's another model. You can do that.
Yeah.
Instead of going to civil war like Biafra, in Africa, or the Indian partition, which turned incredibly violent, or the Czech Republic, which split apart. Switzerland is the other. I studied in Switzerland for a year. My parents sent me to boarding school because I was a very bad boy, and they wanted me to learn Schmidt Deutsch. French, Romansh, and I went and discovered to my amazement that the Swiss have all these different languages. I just mentioned, I think there are 4 of them. I had to learn Romansh, which nobody speaks, but where my boarding school was, they speak Romansh, so we had to learn that.
Great.
And instead of splitting apart, they found a way to share power with a shared executive that rotates, keep their language in each of the different regions, and keep the country together. And Switzerland is a fantastic country, very successful. People are educated and wealthy. But they avoided splitting up into tiny little things that could never sustain themselves. So that impressed me quite a bit, that you can be very different. And Marjorie Taylor Greene can be very different and hate a bunch of socialists. But you probably can coexist on some issues. And my point is, and I had one of my former students who is a big executive in a big American company send me a nice text that he said, it's true, if in my company we were to always stress the things that we have that are different and that we disagree on, my company would be in disaster, would be bankrupt and falling apart. So in companies, in hospitals, and in golf clubs, in every place, you can have differences, but if you stress those differences and spend all your time on that, you're going to not be successful. You're not going to win. The way you win is by finding, even if it's a small number of things that you can agree on. And that's the way Congress is supposed to work. And in the past, that's why it's worked, is you go, no, let's not talk about that, because I'm going to go get my Glock, if we go down that road. Let's talk about a few things that we might be able to agree on and pass legislation and, get things done. And
let's keep rolling here, because we're already halfway through it, believe it or not. But it does segue very nicely what you're talking about there with these factions. And I think they're growing, that are calling for this type of split divorce. It's always been in the underbelly of the country. I used to think of it mostly as being on the right wing side, but that's because I'm on the left wing side. But I'm seeing more of it now kind of move a little more mainstream, and people on the left are talking about it, as you mentioned, as well. And that's kind of got me paying attention. It's bad, and it may get worse. And here's why. Let's bring this up on screen. Let me click the right button here. It would be because of this guy. I'm telling you, Doc, if this guy gets reelected, there are people that are going to want to flee the country on the left side of the spectrum. They hate this guy. Iowa or bust. Why the 2024 GOP caucuses are more important than ever. And this gets right into your sweet spot here with the Iowa caucuses. The Republicans are going to be first in the nation with theirs. The Democrats are going to go, who knows? And this is in the Des Moines Register. Republicans hoping to make a splash in the 2024 presidential nomination process may have a shorter runway than usual to launch a campaign that can draw national support, making Iowa's first in the nation caucuses an even more critical early benchmark of success. For former President Donald Trump, a big win in Iowa could cement his hold on the party and help him build traction with voters in later states, while a loss could indicate debilitating vulnerabilities, and the growing cadre of Republicans challenging him are expected to face increased pressure, and this highlighting is mine now, from national donors hoping to avoid the kind of fractured field that helped elevate Trump to the nomination in 2016. And I emphasize that because who's running the show? Who's behind the curtains? Who's pulling the levers? Folks, it's these donors, and the donors are tied to the military-industrial complex. That's who a lot of these donors are, and so I talk about that on my show all the time. Those donors are unlikely to tolerate candidates who fail to amass serious support by caucus day. And this is the last comment here. Quote, I think what will happen in Iowa is that quickly the party in America will see who are the 2 or 3, maybe even just one viable candidate going up against the former president. That's why I think there's going to be a call on the other candidates to begin a coalescing and a narrowing of the field. Now, that's Eric Wolfson. he's a Republican political consultant. But I would remind everyone that that's pretty much what happened to Bernie Sanders. And Barack Obama was the person that sounded the call for them to coalesce behind Biden. And why I think this is more possible, more probable than ever on the Republican side. They're going to want to have a nominee very quickly, and they will run to Trump if it means no Biden. People aren't supporting or voting for people in this country for people like they used to. They're voting against them. The same thing on the Democratic side. And I've got some slides on that too. There's a lot of unhappiness with Biden, but it's this blue no matter who movement. But mostly it's no Trump. They do not want that guy to come back. And people look at Biden and think, hell, I don't know if he can win a caucus. I don't know if he can win a primary. I don't know if he can win re-election. Well, from the Democrats' perspective, if it comes between him and Trump, oh, yeah, they'll vote Biden. Hell, they'll vote for the local dog catcher instead of Trump. And that's the dynamic that I see with the caucuses for the Republicans that are coming up, and then for, the primary in New Hampshire or South Carolina. Where's that stand, Doc? What's going to happen with the Democrats?
Well, I mean, the Democrats, I think, as I either predicted or said I thought would happen, are going to go ahead. They're going to have the Iowa caucuses first, I think, in some form or another. And as I said, Iowa doesn't have a lot of delegates to the Democratic National Convention. So if they hold the caucuses and do it successfully, and somehow the people running can avoid being punished by the Democrats, and the Democratic National Committee says, we're not going to recognize Iowa delegates at the National Convention, it doesn't really matter. There are very few delegates, and the caucuses are much more important in a sense because they're so high visibility, as we found out with Jimmy Carter. The Governor Sununu in New Hampshire and the Secretary of State of New Hampshire have said, we're going to have the primary in New Hampshire, first in the nation. The Democrats in New Hampshire are really angry at President Biden, who largely manipulated the party to make South Carolina up high up on the list. And New Hampshire is going to have the primary first. I'm absolutely certain of that. And so the tradition, which I love, the tradition, when you read a book, you want it to start with something that grabs your attention and makes you want to go through the rest of the 500 pages. It was a dark and stormy night. and you want to start the American presidential process with something that has a lot of great stories and, food on a deep fried stick and little piglets being handed to candidates who have never touched a piglet and didn't know where their bacon came from. Those are unforgettable. In New Hampshire, you have Dixville Notch, which is a tiny little resort town up in northern New Hampshire. During the caucuses, there are no tourists there. It's a huge resort hotel, but there are employees, and they always have their primary always closes in Dixville Notch first, and then the rest of the state. And the media is there. There are more media people than there are voters covering how did the people in Dixville Notch vote, in the primary. And those are great stories. If you have big primaries with nothing but TV media, you don't have a good story. It's not a great story. So even though, yes, Iowa is not racially and otherwise, diversity representative of the country, it's been a good place to start all this. I think. I know a lot of people disagree with me, and they can send hate mail to George.
Yeah, thanks. I need some more.
I think that's going to happen. And Donald Trump is coming to Iowa, and then DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who is the other, I think, potential contender. Some people think he doesn't do very well in debates and all that, but boy, he's getting a tremendous amount of buzz. And he is doing things that are similar to Trump in many ways, going after woke, taking away books, sexually explicit material in schools, and, prohibiting masks and vaccines. mandates. So DeSantis probably will do okay unless he implodes. And then so that there are at least two on the menu. Others who said they were going to run already are dropping out, right? On the Republican side.
Yeah.
So I think the field probably isn't going to be enormous, although there are continuous individuals who say they're going to run. And the Democrats, I think there's already one person who has said she's going to run. She's some sort of a guru who.
Marianne Williamson, you're talking about.
Marianne Williams. I don't know Marianne Williams. I've never listened to her, lessons or read her books or gone to any of her seminars. And I doubt if a lot of people think that she would be presidential material. So she'll get a few votes maybe. And what are you going to do? I mean, who is the Democrat that can challenge Biden, a guy who has an entire lifetime of political experience? Has, as president, a lot of people say he hasn't done anything. He's done a lot of stuff in the 2 years that he's been president. He's done a tremendous amount of stuff. And, how do you know that Pete Buttigieg is going to do more and get elected? He's not going to get elected. And Bernie Sanders is history. Bernie Sanders is too old and too sort of cranky. The sitting at the inauguration with his little gloves on and looking like a little nebbish. I'm sorry, George, I know you love Bernie Sanders.
Well, no, I think Bernie's highly ineffective. I think he could go down in the annals of American history as one of the biggest losers there ever was. And I blame Bernie for not taking his movement in 2016. And instead of running again for the president within the Democratic Party, doing something with that movement, just with the email list that he had, if nothing else. He didn't do anything. He stayed within the Democratic Party. They did to him in 2020 what they did to him in 2016. It's like, Bernie, you're a Momo. I mean, come on. Here's the thing with Bernie Sanders. He's not going to run against Joe Biden. Joe Biden's already said he's going to run. Yeah. Bernie has already told us that Joe Biden is his friend. Bernie is a Democrat. Now, he's a different kind of a Democrat, a curmudgeon sitting out there, but he's going to support the Democratic nominee, and that's going to be Joe Biden. I think we're going to end up with Biden versus Trump. That's the way it looks like to me, and people not voting for someone, but voting against someone. Let me bring this up on screen, Doc, to kind of get to what I'm talking about here a little bit. And this has to do with the left. And Medea Benjamin has been on my show. She's the co-founder of Code Pink. She's a big anti-war voice. I love Medea Benjamin. This was on Twitter. And she's talking about the CPAC conference where Trump came away the winner. I don't even know how they tell for sure, but I mean, he swept through CPAC, not surprisingly. But Medea says Trump knows how unpopular the Ukraine war is. He got huge applause at CPAC saying, quote, the Donald here, I am the only candidate who can prevent World War III. Before I arrive in the Oval Office, I don't know what the hell that means, I will end the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine. Biden, Medea says, we need peace talks now. Well, here's the point. If people will recall, and I know you do, Doc, in 2016, this is the kind of shit that Trump was talking about in those debates. He was coming off as a populist. He was almost left-wing. I mean, he was anti-war. He was going to do marvelous things for healthcare in this country. He was making all of these promises, none of which were fulfilled, all of whom got forgotten the day that he sat down in the Oval Office. But this works. And why does it work? It's because so many people want this. But Trump's the only one that will lie to them in their face, basically, to get elected. The Democrats won't even lie, let alone do it when they get in there. But I thought this was very revealing that Trump is portraying himself as the peace candidate, for God's sake.
Yeah, I still have some confidence in voters that they will think and realize that, it's pretty dangerous to have someone who is extreme. I think Joe Biden isn't really extreme, although conservatives think that he's a big left-wing socialist. He's not really. You can tell by the way left-wing or progressives like yourself react to him. And I'm telling you that it's going to be an interesting struggle, and it's going to be maybe more intense than normal. Mary Knox posted that it's the social media that is driving us apart and dividing us, and the answer is yes, it is. Social media does that, but in the past there were other things that were driving us apart. I mean, newspapers were very powerful and they were partisan, so they were where people got their news, and some of them were very conservative or nationalist, and others were other stuff. And we got into a war with Spain, the Spanish-American War, over Cuba, and then Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, because a newspaper chain pushed this and got people hysterical about the Spanish sinking the Maine in Havana Harbor and being this bogeyman like the Chinese are becoming. So media has always had a real powerful effect, and churches and religions had a powerful effect as well. John Roberts posted and said that Iowa and New Hampshire are going to become nothing but straw polls, since delegates really are, selected in other states, and our delegates probably in Iowa and in New Hampshire probably won't be recognized by the Democratic Party. Well, John, the Iowa caucuses were always what they called a beauty contest. They were really never, the Iowa caucuses themselves were never a delegate selection process. They were a media event, and there are people who didn't like the caucuses ever because they were a big media brouhaha event. And, the delegates are actually selected up away from the caucuses to the county convention and then the district convention, and they're actually really selected at the state conventions in Iowa, and then some delegates are sent to the national conventions, but there's so few. So I don't have a problem with Iowa being a powerful straw poll that calls attention to politics, gives candidates a chance to sell themselves, attracts a lot of media. And remember, the media is not limited to Iowans and Iowa. The media is national and international. I have never had to interpret something for so many people as I've had to interpret how the caucuses work, especially the Democratic caucuses, which are so freaking complicated. To media from, I still have connections in Japan and South Korea, some Middle Eastern, certainly Latin American ones who go, Dr. Schmidt, no entiendo cómo funcionan los caucuses, por favor. And I've been invited by CNN en Español, Univision, Telemundo, to actually brief their reporters and anchors close to the caucuses, because they don't understand how the Democratic caucuses work. And, so it attracted this intense media attention. And all right, so they're straw polls in some respect, or beauty contests, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. Haley, by the way, Mary Knox says, don't forget Nikki Haley.
Yeah.
Don't forget Nikki Haley. But the Republicans apparently are forgetting Nikki Haley. Most people think that Nikki Haley, first of all, insulted old guys like me by saying, that if you're over a certain age, you should be put out to pasture, or maybe taken behind the barn. I don't know. And that ticked me off. And it certainly ticked off any older Americans who are dynamic, who are hardworking, who are smart, who are experienced. To say that somebody who's in their 40s would make a better president, maybe not, that's a question. And the Republicans, I don't think there's a lot of fire being started under Nikki Haley's announcements. But there may be others who come up. But right now, it looks like the Republicans are going to go with Donald Trump and probably DeSantis, who is a very clever politician.
Yeah,
Very,
that's what I would say. I would be worried about DeSantis more than Trump, because Trump's already proven that he's highly ineffective. He's not very good at legislating. He doesn't build alliances and coalitions, and he didn't get much done. He did give rich guys a tax break when he was in there, and he did shower big corporate farming concerns with money. But I would fear DeSantis, because I think he might actually get more of that agenda that he shares with Trump done if he got in there. And but I still don't. I don't think it's going to go very far this time, because immediately, and it didn't go very far last time either. But by the time we get out of Iowa into a few states, or both camps are going to go, we got to get behind this guy, because if we don't, we're going to get this guy. So I think they're immediately going to do that. I wanted to bring this up on screen, Doc. You talk about the media, and I guessed it on a show a couple of weeks ago, talking about Iowa and politics and podcasting in particular. They wanted to know why I got involved in this. And I've explained this on my show before, with my coming out of corporate America and taking a look around and discovering that there was no left-wing platform. There was, MSNBC and CNN are what I would call, Dixiecrats at the very least, probably Republican Democrats, probably Reaganites, from when I was looking at it back in the 80s. And of course, the right wing has gone off the end of the right side of the political platform, but there's no left wing. There's Fox for the right. There's MSNBC and CNN for these kind of new age Republicans that we're looking at and calling Democrats. But I wanted to bring this up on screen because I think this illustrates what's happening here. As far as, the big three on the PBG is climate, war, and healthcare. What about war? This is from Jimmy Dore. He says, why is Tucker Carlson the only corporate news host bringing on guests who tell the truth about Ukraine and the U.S. blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline? Why doesn't MSNBC or CNN ever bring on anti-war voices? Why aren't their viewers pissed off that they're getting Tucker to outdo them? And this is an unusual thing. This little graphic down here, this is Dennis Kucinich, for God's sakes, on Tucker Carlson. Kucinich he's a true left-winger. This is one of the last left-wing Democrats in Congress. They got run out, basically. He didn't get support from the Democratic Party. They actually helped gerrymander his district to get him out. But this is a left-wing guy, and to get a platform and to be heard, he has to go on Fox, which is interesting. Anti-war voices are migrating to Fox Television, and the Republicans are picking up the mantra for anti-war. Why? Well, obviously, the most of them just because they hate Biden and they want to denigrate anything that he's behind or has anything to do with. But still, I find this very interesting, Doc.
Well, it is interesting. And of course, we don't know ultimately what the cost is going to be, because I've been to a whole bunch of different places in the U.S. in the last year since the war in Ukraine. And I've never in my entire life seen the flag of a foreign country being flown off of trucks, motorcycles, hanging in store windows. The Ukrainian flag, is all over the place. So we don't particularly care for Vladimir Putin and the Russians, who are, communists. I mean, I know that they're not communists anymore. The Soviet Union is done with. But boy, it sure is, I think, a dangerous game to be playing, basically undermining Western Europe, because Ukraine is just essentially the front line for Western Europe. So when you take on Ukraine and say, we shouldn't be supporting the Ukrainian government, you're also saying we shouldn't be supporting the defense and deterrence of all of Western Europe, all the way from the Balkan states, Germany and France and all the rest of them. They're very worried. And in fact, the criticism in Europe, I have a lot of family in Germany. Obviously, Schmidt is a German name, even though I was born in Colombia. My parents were immigrants. And the Germans are saying, and, Prime Minister Scholz and others are saying, man, we made a huge mistake by letting our military basically deteriorate and become weak and not spending enough and not being upgraded, because it didn't serve as a deterrence and a warning to the Russians and to someone like Putin who has ambitions to build an empire. So I'm not sure that Tucker is, going down a path that is going to be very successful. Somebody has to make the case, which I had discussions with some of my friends who are military experts and former students who said, look, we're not giving Ukraine billions of dollars. The billions of dollars of aid to Ukraine actually are spent in the U.S. To manufacture munitions, tanks, weapon systems, consultants, all kinds of stuff, just like U.S. foreign aid. The people who say, oh, we got to cut foreign aid. Well, if you cut foreign aid, you're cutting a lot of money that goes to farmers to send, food supplies to countries and so on. The other thing is that the American military is learning more about Russia, which is its main adversary. China is kind of becoming one now. In terms of Russia's military capability, Russia's strategic military thinking with the defense of Ukraine, than in all the years since World War II, because, we were cooking up theories about Russia and its military and its particular strategic model, and those have turned out to be not correct. Ukraine is giving the Americans in the United States a lot of incredibly important intelligence about Russia and how to basically restrain Russia from continuing to do what they've done. They invaded Chechnya, they invaded Georgia, now they invaded Ukraine. And Putin has said, I want to rebuild the big Russian empire, the imperial Russian empire. I want to bring back all those places, the Baltic states and, Poland and Hungary and, Czechoslovakia, which was also part of the Eastern Bloc. And the Europeans are now suddenly saying, oh, my God, we really screwed up and NATO isn't enough. I know that some people, including you, say that it was NATO that basically triggered Putin's sort of defensive, what he thinks is defensive reaction. But Putin hasn't been a good boy on a lot of things.
Oh, Putin, nobody's. He needs no apologies. Yeah.
Okay. The world is bilateral. You either side with the wife or the husband. You either side with Western Europe, the United States, England, Japan, South Korea, and so on. Or you side with Putin and maybe the Chinese, and you make up your mind. There is no neutral ground. I'm sorry. I know that sounds irrational, but there is no neutral ground. And so that's, kind of where we are right now.
Yeah. And I put up that comment from John Roberts. I want to put up the great Mary Knox too, because she's a great friend of Podcast by George. And this is the thinking that we share that you mentioned. And we can talk about Ukraine another day. We'll spend a whole show on it easily, I think, but we're out of time here today, Doc. I did want to bring this up on screen because I got asked off air about a viewer that this is a Biden reelection bid faces resistance from some Democrats. And they're talking about New Hampshire here. But then this article was out of the AP. And I got to tell you, Doc, I don't know much about this guy. Ex-Maryland Governor Larry Hogan says he won't challenge Trump. Larry Hogan, the former Republican governor of Maryland, who positioned himself as one of the party's fiercest critics of Donald Trump, said Sunday he will not challenge the ex-president for the GOP's White House nomination in 2024. I will never run for president to sell books or position myself for a cabinet role. The 66-year-old Hogan wrote in the New York Times, I have long said, now this is interesting, and we'll leave it here, but this last quote from him I thought was very interesting, very revealing. I have long said that I care more about ensuring a future for the Republican Party than securing my own future in the Republican Party. And that's why I will not be seeking the Republican nomination for president. Okay, I bitch all the time about the military-industrial complex, the spooks and the kooks behind the curtain, the blob, that is responsible for everything we are, the inverted totalitarianism, the upside-down corporatism in this country, where corporations control our government, and so on and so on. Yeah. But that Hogan guy is hitting on an interesting thing there. To him, I think the most important thing is the party. And there are a lot of people on both sides of the political spectrum like that. And I always flash back to Nixon. What brought him down? It was screwing with the political process, and we have people crawling through the windows of the Capitol here because they thought an election was stolen. It seems to me like the real power that above us really are these damn political parties. And this guy is not going to run because he wants to help preserve the Republican Party, Doc.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, who the hell is Larry Hogan?
Yeah, who is Larry Hogan?
Getting a nomination was zero. Larry Hogan is nobody in the Republican Party. Yes, the left and liberals and CNN like Larry Hogan because he's kind of a Republican maverick, but he's not nobody in the Republican Party, and he's, I'm not sure how charismatic he is. I know I'm going to get a lot of hate mail. Send it to George because he doesn't look presidential.
No.
He just, of course, if there had been polls showing that, 36.2% of Republicans say we want Larry Hogan, he'd be running. But, the number of Republicans saying we want Larry Hogan is what, 2%, 1%, maybe not even that. So those are all BS, comments that people make. And in terms of Biden and the Democrats, they don't want Biden. No, that's not true. Remember, Hillary Clinton had opponents, right? I mean, really, really strong opponents. And those opponents partly are the reason she lost the election, because the Bernie poodles there, they didn't vote for Hillary Clinton because they felt that the Clinton people had cheated Bernie out of the nomination. So there are always factions that don't like whoever it is that's running. That's nothing new. I mean, you're making it seem like, oh my God, there are a lot of Democrats who don't want Biden to run. Yeah, then that's good because they can raise some issues and bring up things that Biden should be doing, but it's not a big deal.
No, what is it?
I don't see the party running, to the edge of the cliff and jumping into the sea on Biden. And, he's got a good base. He's got a good organization. He's going to get a lot of support from the big money donors. And, if he wants to be the nominee, he probably easily can be the nominee. And if he wants to win in November, he has a 51.3% chance of winning, or maybe bigger than that, depending on who the Republicans run.
If they run Trump.
Tulsi Gabbard, I'm surprised she hasn't announced that she's running against Biden.
Yeah, I can't figure Tulsi out. I've kind of lost faith with her, primarily because of her militarism. I agree with everything she talks about, and she's a big anti-war voice as an example, but she's a contributing factor. I mean, she's serving in the military, and she comes back from Africa over there in deepest, darkest Spookville, Africa, on some type of military operation that most people didn't even know was underway, and comes back here and tells us how she's keeping us safe from what? Some villages over there in Africa. I don't even know where it was at, but it was, come on, Tulsi. But that's a subject for another day. And sure. So is Ukraine. God, we got to get back. We'll do a whole show on Ukraine, you and I, and we'll get some of these other people in here because you're right. We don't look at that the same way. But I do want to give you last word here today. We got about a minute or so for you to wrap it up, put a close on this issue of Podcast by George.
Well, I think that we're headed into a stormy climate politically. I think that, this summer is going to be very, very exciting politically. Biden will probably announce pretty soon. Donald Trump is going to continue to throw hand grenades and run. DeSantis is playing it coy, but I think pretty soon you're going to see a real clash of civilizations in the Republican Party. DeSantis is, even though he's had some policies that are similar to Trump, he's a very different candidate. And I think it's going to be really interesting, fascinating to watch that. And the Democrats, I have a feeling the Democrats are going to, try to rally around a candidate, and it'll be Joe Biden probably. And, people are saying that Joe Biden is really running the country. Come on, guys, just shut up. They said that, Hillary Clinton was running the country when Bill was president. And, maybe she gave him some advice and whispered in his ear, but Bill Clinton was running the country, folks. Don't try to make up stuff.
All right, great. We'll just get back here with you very shortly because I've got twice as much stuff we can talk. That's how, like Doc says, you may not like politics, but politics likes us. It's involved in everything, and we could do a show with a Doc at least once a week. But anyway, we're going to let him go for now. Dr. Politics, Steffen W. Schmidt, the Lucan Endowed Professor of Political Science of Iowa State University, Professor Emeritus. Thanks for coming on Podcast by George.
Thank you. Always a great pleasure. You always ask wonderful questions. And, I wish some more of my friends had posted stuff. Some of them are really nasty people, and we could have made fun of them.
That's the nature of the beast. Thanks, Doc. We'll talk again soon. And folks, I got to tell you, if you like Podcast by George, and particularly if you're like me and what you are concerned about are the big three: climate, war, and healthcare. To me, everything else is gingerbread, including maybe some of the things we discussed today, because in the 2020 world that we live in, we're going to be dead in 20 years because of climate if we don't do something big. I mean, and the only person promising to do anything big is Trump, for God's sake. We need to do something big on climate, bigger than what Biden is doing, certainly. We got to go big or it's game over in less than 20 years. War, of course. My God, we're on the teetering brink of World War III, a nuclear accidental firing of a tactical weapon or something like that could end it all for all of us. And then, of course, if you have access to health care, which they like to say we do in the country, but really can't afford it, and you really don't go to the doctor when you should, and you die, everything else is gingerbread. But folks, that's going to wrap it up. That's going to do it for this particular episode of Podcast by George. And to follow along with us now, to subscribe on Facebook and YouTube, particularly to get these live video streams, go to podcastbygeorge.com and click on the Facebook and YouTube icons, the little banners that are there, and they'll take you right to the home pages where you can subscribe and be notified, ring the notification bell on YouTube, give me a thumbs up there and leave a comment, those types of things for those platforms. And then just to listen to the audio while you're driving or taking a walk or riding your bike or whatever the case might be on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, the iHeartRadio app, Deezer, all kinds of places like that. That also is on podcastbygeorge.com. But that's going to do it, folks. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another Podcast by George.